I stood in the middle of a lavish inheritance party as the video played revealing Aunt Lydia's true face to a crowd of stunned guests. "She's lying. Shut it off! Shut it off!" she screamed. But I didn't. I had lived 10 years in the basement swallowing insults and bruises in silence, just for this moment. My mother's journal, the hidden will, and her expression when the truth exploded every second was worth it. If you think this is just another family story, you're dead wrong. Subscribe now to catch more twisted, emotional, and sweetly vengeful storytelling episodes from us. The first time I saw a rat, I didn't scream. I just watched it shuffle across the cracked cement floor of the basement, its tail trailing behind like a question mark no one dared to ask. I was 10 years old barefoot, wearing a threadbare nightgown 2 sizes too small, and holding a mop with a splintered handle. It was winter, but down there it always felt colder than outside. They called it the lower pantry, but I knew better. It was the place where the warmth of the house didn't reach, where the pipes cried all night and mildew grew like secrets on the walls. My bed was a cot tucked behind the boiler, and the only light came from a dangling bulb that flickered like it was afraid to stay on too long. My name is Tasha Dawson, and for most of my childhood I lived beneath the Redfield estate, beneath its marble floors, beneath its crystal chandeliers, beneath its web of lies. They say your childhood shapes you. Mine molded me in the dark among shadows that whispered names I didn't understand. I used to count the footsteps from the main floor to know who was walking above me. Lydia had sharp, confident steps, heels clicking with the precision of someone who knew she owned every inch of the house. Uncle Mason shuffled. He always smelled like pipe smoke and something sour. But me, I wasn't supposed to be heard at all. Lydia would smile with porcelain teeth when guests arrived. "Tasha's just a bit shy," she'd say, her voice sugar-sweet as she guided them toward the drawing room. "She's around here somewhere." Then she'd glance at me over her shoulder with eyes so sharp they could slice bone. The moment the guests were gone, that smile melted like wax. "Did I ask you to be seen?" she'd snap, grabbing my arm so hard I'd have bruises the next day. "You're lucky we didn't send you to an orphanage." Lucky. That word stuck with me. I repeated it to myself some nights like a charm against the dark. Lucky. Lucky they kept me. Lucky I had a bed. Lucky I had food. Lucky, even though the food was often leftovers scraped off silver platters. Even though my bed was next to a leaking pipe that hissed like it hated me. Even though I was always cold, always afraid, always less. When my parents died, I was told it was an accident, something about food poisoning bad mussels from a summer picnic. But even at 8 years old, I remember the way Lydia looked at the casket. Not grief, not loss, just calculation. She held my hand tightly during the funeral, too tightly, her nails digging crescents into my skin. Later that day, I overheard her whisper to Uncle Mason, "We'll manage it. She's too young to understand." Understand what? They took me in because they had to. The Redfield name couldn't be tainted by scandal, and my father, Lydia's younger brother, had married someone beneath their standards, someone they never truly accepted. My mother, Eleanor, was a schoolteacher with strong opinions and an even stronger will. I think that's why they hated her. They let me stay, but not as family. My first night at Redfield, Lydia led me past the grand staircase and the velvet-lined halls, down a narrow servants' corridor, and opened a creaking door at the end. "This is where you'll sleep," she said, not unkindly, but not kindly either. "It's just temporary, darling, until we sort things out." That temporary turned into months, then years. At 10, I knew the routine like clockwork. Wake before dawn, clean the breakfast room, empty the ashtrays in the library even if no one used them. Polish the brass fixtures, hide when the guests came, smile when spoken to, disappear when not, and always, always keep out of Lydia's way when her voice turned flat. But that morning, that particular morning in January, something shifted. I had been scrubbing the cellar floor when I heard it faint, deliberate, measured. A laugh. Not Lydia's, not Mason's. A man's voice, rich and unfamiliar, drifting down through the air vents. I paused, clutching the mop handle. "I heard the girl is still here," the man said, and the way he said girl made me feel like a ghost, like I wasn't real. Living in the basement, no less. Isn't that a bit Dickensian, Lydia? There was a beat of silence, and then Lydia's voice floated down like perfume laced with venom. "She prefers it down there. Always has. Quiet little thing. We give her everything she needs." I didn't breathe. My heartbeat pounded in my throat. "She's family, isn't she?" the man pressed. Lydia laughed. That brittle laugh. In name only. I stared at my reflection in the bucket of soapy water. My face warped in the ripples. In name only. That night I didn't sleep. I lay on the cot, staring up at the metal ceiling, trying to remember the sound of my mother's voice. But it had been too long. It was already slipping away. Instead, I remembered something else. Something my father used to tell me when I was scared. "You have your mother's fire," he'd whisper, tucking me in. "Don't let anyone make you small." Small. That's what I had become. A girl tucked in a cellar made to feel like a mistake, like a burden someone had reluctantly agreed to carry. But that night, lying awake with the echo of Lydia's voice ringing in my ears, I felt something stir. Not fire, not yet. Just heat. A flicker. I got up and crept through the basement, barefoot and silent. I moved past the storage shelves, past the old wine crates until I reached the far wall. There was a section there, an old bricked-off archway that didn't match the rest of the wall. I'd always ignored it. Lydia once told me not to touch anything in that corner. Dangerous, she'd said. Old wiring. But now I looked at it differently. The mortar was uneven. The bricks slightly discolored. And something told me deep in the part of me that still believed in my mother's whispers that whatever was behind that wall didn't want to be forgotten. I pressed my palm against the brick. It was cold, solid, unmoving. But I felt it, the hum of something buried, something waiting. They thought I would stay quiet forever. They thought the darkness had made me theirs. But I was listening, and someday I would speak. I used to think I was the leftover, I whisper now, looking back. The orphan. The burden. The basement girl. But the truth, I was the secret they never meant to survive. And eventually I did more than survive. I uncovered everything. At 17, I moved like furniture. I didn't speak unless spoken to, I didn't breathe too loudly, and I never ever looked guests in the eye. My existence at the Redfield estate was utilitarian. I was a fixture like the fireplace pokers or the antique umbrella stand by the door. You noticed it only if it was missing or out of place. And I was never allowed to be out of place. For nearly a decade, I had scrubbed silver platters I never ate from and dusted paintings of people whose names I didn't know, but whose eyes still managed to look down on me. There were no framed photos of my parents in the house. Only one sat buried in my drawer, the corner frayed where I clutched it too tightly. But Lydia had framed herself in every hallway. Her portraits lined the main staircase in gala gowns and boardroom suits as if to say, "This is my empire." She ruled the estate with white gloves, bloodless and efficient. She could organize a charity fundraiser, fire a maid, and crush a soul in the same afternoon without breaking her smile. And somehow I was still here. The girl in the basement who never really left it even when I walked the upper halls. They let me upstairs now, not as family, not even as staff, just as something adjacent. I was useful, so I was tolerated. I cleaned the guest rooms before formal dinners. I restocked the liquor cabinet. I fetched forgotten earrings, lint-rolled suit jackets, ironed napkins, folded place cards. I learned to take up no space to blend into wallpaper and wait for permission to disappear. 10 years in that house had taught me survival. Not through strength, through submission. Until that afternoon, it was mid-May, humid with storm clouds gathering like judgment over the hills. The estate was buzzing another Redfield inheritance celebration. Not a funeral this time, not even a will reading. This one was more performative. Lydia and Mason had finalized a major trust restructuring, and Lydia was hosting what she called a family gathering to commemorate legacy stewardship. What it really meant was she was showing off the fact that the estate now legally belonged to her. Every inch, every coin. I was polishing the grand mirror in the front hall when she appeared behind me, voice sweet as saccharin. "Tasha, darling," she said. "You'll help with coats tonight, yes. And do be a dear and dust the parlor again. The light's so unforgiving at dusk." I nodded. "Of course, always. And you'll stay invisible, won't you?" I turned back to my reflection. The girl in the mirror looked back with hollow obedience. "Yes, Aunt Lydia." The party began just before 7. Chandeliers blazed, the string quartet played something Vivaldi-ish, and the smell of citrus-polished wood drifted through the house. I stood beside the coat check, dressed in black slacks and a blouse that used to be my mother's, ironed within an inch of its life. Guests arrived in waves, board members, distant cousins, old money neighbors with last names that opened doors. Laughter clinked like glass. Lydia greeted everyone as if she were royalty. Mason smiled like a man who didn't have much to say but liked the power of being married to someone who did. Then somewhere between the second and third round of cocktails, she did what she always did when the moment required pageantry. She brought me out. "Oh, and here's our sweet Tasha," she cooed, gesturing to me like I was a show dog. My late brother's child. We took her in, of course, raised her like one of our own. My throat closed. The guest smiled politely, nodded in my direction, offered a smattering of rehearsed condolences for a decade-old death. I gave a slight bow of the head. Lydia beamed as if she'd donated a kidney. She's quite the helper, you know. A silent little shadow, but always so efficient. They laughed. I died a little. I excused myself and fled to the back kitchen, pretending to need water. My hands trembled. I gripped the counter and tried to steady my breathing. That's when I heard his voice. "Still the same, isn't she?" I turned. The man standing near the doorway was in his 70s, tall, angular, dressed in a gray three-piece suit that had clearly been tailored decades ago and maintained with obsessive care. His hair was more silver than white, neatly combed. He held a glass of whiskey untouched. I didn't recognize him at first. Not exactly. But something about the way he looked at me steady appraising felt familiar. "You're Tasha," he said, more a confirmation than a question. "Yes, I knew your father." I nodded cautiously. I'd heard that sentence 1,000 times. From guest staff, even the man who trimmed the hedges. But this man said it differently. "I'm Howard Daniels," he said. "Your father's lawyer. His friend, actually." The name clicked. I remembered hearing it in hushed tones, always in past tense. My father trusted Daniels. Lydia did not. "I saw you at the funeral," he added, eyes narrowing slightly. "You wouldn't look up. You kept your face buried in Lydia's sleeve." I remembered the itchy fabric, the way she held me too tightly like a leash disguised as comfort. "I was scared," I said. Daniels nodded, as she intended. There was silence for a moment. Then he added, "I asked about you, after the funeral, where you'd be staying. Lydia said you were fine, comfortable, that you preferred the basement." He looked at me sharply now. "Do you prefer the basement, Tasha?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. He studied me, then softened his expression. "Your father was a good man," he said. "Far from perfect. Stubborn as hell. But he adored your mother. And you." I clenched my hands. I don't remember much. Daniels hesitated, as if weighing something. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Yellowed at the edges, my name was written on it in a looping, familiar hand. "I wasn't sure when the right time would be," he said. "Maybe it's not now, but I didn't come tonight to drink Lydia's liquor." He placed the envelope on the counter and stepped back. "You're not invisible, Tasha. You've just been standing in a house that refuses to see." And then he was gone. I didn't open the envelope, not that night. Instead, I folded it neatly and placed it beneath my mattress. That night, as the party wound down and laughter faded into drunken murmurs, I sat on the edge of my cot in the basement and looked at my reflection in the bucket again. 10 years had passed. I had scrubbed, served, obeyed. I had nodded at cruelty and smiled at betrayal. I had been the silent helper, the orphan turned accessory. But for the first time, I felt something change. Not rage, not even grief, just clarity. They had raised me like one of their own, Lydia said. And maybe they had. Because that night, for the first time in years, I started thinking like a Redfield. But I didn't plan to stay one. The sound came at night. Not loud, not sudden. Just a soft, hollow thud like something shifting behind the walls of the basement. It might have been a pipe, or the wood frame settling, or a rat dragging something heavier than it should. I'd heard the house groan before it was old, full of secrets, but this was different. This sound had weight, like it wanted to be noticed. I was lying on my cot, staring at the cracked ceiling above my father's envelope, still unopened under my pillow. Lydia and Mason were upstairs asleep or drunk, and the storm outside had finally passed. Rainwater still dripped through a corner of the window pane, steady like a ticking clock. Then it came again. Thump! I sat up slowly, swinging my legs over the side of the cot. The basement light buzzed overhead, casting yellow half-shadows across the cement floor. I stayed still, listening. Silence. Then tap, tap, thud. It was coming from the far side of the room. The forgotten wall. The one Lydia always called unsafe and structurally unstable. The same excuse she gave to the workers when they asked about the bricked-off alcove years ago. No one questioned her, of course. Lydia's words were gospel in this house. But I knew better. I'd always known. I grabbed the flashlight from beneath the shelf and crossed the room barefoot. My breath felt like a weight in my chest. The flashlight beam cut through the dust as I approached the far wall. Up close I could see it again. The bricks weren't uniform. Slightly different in color, slightly different in spacing. Too clean, too precise to be original. I knelt, ran my hand across the mortar. It was softer than the others, damp almost. I pressed my ear to the wall. Silence. Then faint but clear shuffle. I didn't scream. I didn't run. Instead, I leaned back, pulled the utility knife from my back pocket, and started to scratch at the seams of the mortar. I didn't even know why I had it on me. Habit, maybe. Protection. Hope. It didn't take much. A few good scrapes, a couple loosened bricks, and then there it was. An edge. A crack. Air stale and cold pushed through like a breath held too long. I widened the gap carefully, one brick at a time, until a space opened wide enough to let me crawl through. I hesitated just for a second, then pushed the flashlight in first and followed on hands and knees. The air inside was still thick with dust. The space was small, maybe 8 feet by 10, and enclosed on all sides with stone. It wasn't a basement room, it was a hidden vault. And in the middle, resting on 2 rusted cinder blocks, was an old wooden chest. My breath caught. I approached slowly, heart pounding in my ears. The chest was covered in a threadbare velvet cloth, the kind my mother used to wrap heirloom teacups. The metal latches had tarnished into green-gray, and one hinge had cracked. I hesitated, then reached out and flipped the lid open. The smell hit first. Dust, old leather, something metallic. Then I saw what lay inside. Journals. A stack of notebooks bound in cloth and string, worn and yellowed with age. Each one had my mother's handwriting on the cover. Eleanor Dawson, 2009. Eleanor Dawson, 2010. Eleanor Dawson, private. And beneath them, papers, receipts, invoices, hospital forms, prescription sheets. At first, it didn't register. I pulled one of the receipts out and held it to the flashlight. The pharmacy logo was faded, but the drug name stood out: thallium sulfate. I blinked. That wasn't cold medicine, that was poison. My hands shook as I flipped through more sheets. Dosages. Multiple purchases. Names redacted. Signed off by a doctor I didn't recognize, but the dates matched. Every one of them lined up with the 3 months before my parents died. Beneath the documents was a sealed envelope. My name written on it in the same looping, careful hand as the journals. For Tasha, when the time is right. I couldn't open it. Not yet. My hands wouldn't let me. But something deep inside me cracked open. All these years I had believed what they told me, that my parents died of contaminated food during a weekend getaway, that no one else got sick was luck, that it was just one of those things. But this wasn't chance. This was deliberate. I sat there in the vault, surrounded by the remnants of my mother's fear, her truth, her warnings. My fingers traced the edges of one of the notebooks. It felt warm, almost like it still carried her touch. I opened the first one, March 3rd. I can't sleep. Mason is watching me again. Not just from across the room, from inside, like he knows I know. Lydia smiles like she doesn't see it, but she sees everything. She just chooses not to care. I turned the page. March 7th. They want the estate. Andrew said no. I told him to stay quiet, to act like nothing's wrong. But he can't. I married a man who believes in right and wrong. He thinks truth will protect us. I'm beginning to think truth only paints targets. Page after page, the words bled from the ink like open wounds. My mother wasn't paranoid. She wasn't delusional. She was terrified. And she was right to be. They had been watching her, gaslighting her, poisoning her. They killed her. And they killed my father for standing beside her. I felt the tears fall hot and angry, smearing dust from my cheeks. I hadn't cried like this in years. Not since the night I buried that version of myself who still believed Lydia when she said, "We're your family now." They weren't my family. They were murderers with clean fingernails and inheritance portfolios. And they didn't know I had found this. They didn't know what my mother had left behind. I sat in the silence of the vault for a long time, rereading the entries, feeling her voice rise from the pages. Every word was a breadcrumb she'd left for me to follow. Every receipt a stone thrown into still water. I finally understood what the sound in the wall was. It wasn't the house settling. It was the truth trying to surface. And I was ready to pull it out brick by brick. The ink had bled into the paper, soft and blue-gray like veins beneath skin. My mother's handwriting, the kind you'd recognize even in your dreams, curved with a slant of urgency, not beauty. This wasn't journaling for posterity. This was confession. I sat cross-legged in the dark vault, the journal heavy in my lap. My flashlight leaned against the brick wall beside me, casting long shadows across the floor. The basement above was silent, but I could feel the weight of the estate pressing down through layers of stone and legacy. I turned the page. March 11th. Andrew's coughing again. He won't say it out loud, but we both feel it. Our tea tastes strange lately. I pretended not to notice, but I poured it down the drain when Lydia wasn't looking. He drank his. He always finishes everything. That's his flaw, his trust. He still thinks blood means something in this family. My father's name hit me like a blow. Andrew. I hadn't heard it spoken aloud in years. Lydia rarely said it, and when she did, it was always past tense, always framed in some vague performative sadness. But my mother's voice here, it was different, urgent, whispering through the years. March 14th, Mason brought home another bottle of wine from his collection. He insisted on pouring. I watched him tip just a little extra into Andrew's glass. Then he looked at me and smiled like we were in on some private joke. I didn't drink mine. I made an excuse, but I think they're watching me now. I flipped to the next page with trembling fingers. March 20th, Andrew woke up vomiting. Fever chills. Lydia said it was the flu. She brought him soup. I smelled something metallic in it. I pretended to eat. Later, when I was alone, I scraped my bowl into the toilet and flushed 3 times. I clutched the edge of the journal so tightly the paper wrinkled under my grip. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't speculation. This was surveillance, poison, murder. My mother had lived in that house knowing she was being hunted. March 25th. The doctor they called refused to run full blood panels. Said it was probably food poisoning. Lydia stood behind him during the visit. I don't think he even noticed how she kept her hand on his shoulder the entire time. The margins of the page were scratched over with frantic notes, names of medications, dosages, questions she'd never get answers to. April 2nd. I tried to confront Lydia today. She laughed. Said I was tired, anxious, that I was imagining shadows in my own house. She hugged me after. Her perfume made my stomach turn. It smells like lilacs now, but I remember when she used to wear gardenia. She changed it the week after Andrew got sick. The change in scent. A detail only someone intimately close would notice. My mother had been cataloging every signal, every pattern. She was trying to leave behind a trail not just for herself, for me. I turned to the last entry in that particular journal. April 9th. He's gone. Just like that. Heart failure, they said. Quiet, peaceful. The funeral was small as they insisted. No autopsy. I wanted to scream. I wanted to burn the whole house down. But I still have you. You're the only reason I'm breathing. The next part was written in larger script, as if her hand had steadied grown colder. April 11th. I found the receipt today. Thallium sulfate. I compared it to Andrew's symptoms. The hair loss, the vomiting, the weakness in his legs. It matches. I know now. I swallowed hard. April 15th. They've started slipping things into my tea, into my bath salts. I can feel it. My hands tremble. My vision blurs. I have no one left but you, Tasha. You're only 7. You ask me why my eyes look tired, why I sleep so much. I can't answer. I can't tell you that every breath feels like it's been borrowed. A tear hit the page before I could stop it. April 18th. I've hidden the receipts, the journals, the documents, all in the vault behind the bricked wall. You won't know about it for a long time. But one day you'll hear something. A sound, a whisper, and you'll follow it. You always do. I closed my eyes as if trying to remember something I hadn't lived. My mother's voice surrounded me now, not in sound, but in presence. The kind of presence that doesn't fade when the body goes. It lingers. It waits. I turned to the very last page. April 21st. If you are reading this, then Lydia has succeeded. The breath left my body. It wasn't just a journal. It was a last will. A coded goodbye. And it ended on a truth I couldn't run from. Lydia had killed them. She had orchestrated it all with that flawless smile, those soft-spoken condolences, the way she wrapped herself in grief like a designer shawl. She'd won. In the eyes of the world, she'd been the benevolent aunt who raised her orphaned niece in the grand family estate. A woman of grace, of dignity. And me, I was the docile girl in the shadows, the girl she'd rescued. But now I held something more powerful than rage. I held proof. Not suspicion, not theory, not rumors or gut instinct. Evidence, receipts, descriptions, names, timelines, and her handwriting. My mother's voice carved across those pages like knives. I sat in that hidden vault, clutching the journal like a lifeline. Everything I'd believed about my life had cracked, shattered. It hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been fate. It had been a decision, premeditated, executed, and covered up with wealth power and manipulation. I felt something shift in my chest. Not a scream, not even a sob. It was resolve. I looked down at the final line again. If you are reading this, then Lydia has succeeded. Not yet. Not if I had anything to say about it. I wiped my face, placed the journal back into the chest with reverence, and gathered the sealed envelope addressed to me, the medical receipts, and the most recent journal. The rest I would leave for now. Hidden. Safe. I knew now that Lydia wasn't just cruel, she was dangerous, and exposing her wouldn't be as simple as walking upstairs and telling the truth. She'd spent years building a version of me that the world believed quiet, unremarkable, lucky to be housed and clothed. She had buried the real Tasha under layers of manipulation and obedience. But my mother hadn't left me alone. She had armed me. And now, with the weight of that journal in my hands, I knew exactly what I had to do. This was no longer a matter of grieving. It was a matter of justice. I didn't call the police. Not because I doubted the evidence, God no. If anything, the pages my mother left behind had crystallized something that had lived murky and buried inside me for years. Her journals weren't speculation. They were detailed, time-stamped records of premeditated murder. A dossier written in real time by a woman slowly dying and watching her world turn hostile. I didn't call the police because I knew Lydia better than that. She would have been ready for it. She always was. She had power, influence, friends on boards and courts on local television. She was a woman who had made charity a personality trait. She could twist sympathy into a weapon and make herself look like the victim even while she strangled you with a silk scarf. No, I wasn't going to give her the chance to spin. This wasn't going to be a headline or a courtroom drama. It was going to be a slow, quiet unraveling, and it started with me becoming exactly who she thought I was. The next morning, I emerged from the basement as if nothing had changed. I made tea, set the breakfast table, fluffed the cushions in the sitting room. I even smiled when Lydia walked in wearing her silk robe, lips painted and ready for a morning Zoom call with the Redfield Foundation's Board of Trustees. "Good morning, Tasha," she chirped. "Don't forget to dust the gallery. The light in there is ruthless." "Of course, Aunt Lydia," I said, keeping my eyes lowered and voice syrupy. She gave me that look, that microsecond scan, like she was always testing for rebellion. Then she nodded once and vanished behind her office door. I turned, still smiling, and went to my room. The plan had already begun. I had copied every page of my mother's journals the night before, scanned, encrypted, and uploaded them to a cloud drive under an anonymous name. Then I created 2 offline backups on encrypted USBs. One stayed in my room, taped behind the headboard. The other I slipped into the glove box of Daniel's old Mercedes the next time I saw him. I knew the house was riddled with cameras, but those were Lydia's. Visible ones. Performative surveillance that made staff behave and gave the illusion of control. The real cameras, the ones that mattered, were the ones I installed myself. I bought them piece by piece. Tiny pinhole lenses, motion-activated audio, battery-powered with cloud sync. I installed the first behind a bookshelf in Mason's study, angled toward the liquor cabinet and the filing drawers beneath. The second went into the corner of the butler's pantry where Lydia took most of her private calls, thinking no one ever used that phone line anymore. And the third, the most dangerous, went into her bedroom. I did it during a brunch she hosted downtown. I knew her schedule to the minute. Her perfume lingered in the air as I carefully unscrewed the panel behind the light fixture and slipped the camera in, wiring it through a Bluetooth repeater I'd hidden in the vent. It was bold. It was stupid, but it worked. And now I had eyes on everything. The next piece of the puzzle was Daniel's. I waited 3 days. I needed to appear normal, submissive, predictable. Then I called him from the community library using a prepaid burner I paid cash for. "Mr. Daniels, it's Tasha." A pause on the other end. Then his voice slower than I remembered. "Yes, I need to talk, in person, somewhere off record." Another pause. Then I know just the place. We met in a rundown diner off the old highway, the kind of place that still had cracked vinyl booths and a jukebox with 2 working songs. He was already seated when I arrived, 2 cups of black coffee between us. He studied me as I sat down. I noticed his tie was crooked, something I couldn't imagine him allowing a week ago. "You read the envelope," he said, not asking. I nodded. I read a lot more than that. He inhaled deep and slow, then leaned back. "Then you know?" "I know she killed them," I said flatly. "Both of them." He looked down at his coffee, swirling it slightly before answering. "I suspected, for years. But suspicion isn't proof." "It is now," I said, sliding a flash drive across the table. He raised an eyebrow. "My mother left everything. Journals, receipts, doctor names, drug records, all of it." He picked up the drive like it was glass. "You realize this puts you in danger." "I've been in danger for 10 years, Mr. Daniels. I just didn't realize it until now." He exhaled through his nose, then nodded. "You said somewhere off record," he said. "Why?" "Because if I go to the police, it dies in bureaucracy. If I go to the press, she spins it into drama. She's too powerful, too practiced. I need something better." Daniels looked at me the way a man might look at a chessboard he thought he'd already lost on. "You want to bury her with her own lies," he said softly. He nodded once. "All right," he said. "Then we do this carefully, legally, but surgically. And slow." "Slow is fine," I replied. "She's been building this lie for a decade. I can wait a few more months if it means tearing her down brick by brick." Daniels leaned in, his voice lowering. "I'll reopen your father's trust paperwork." Quietly. "There are files I was asked to store indefinitely when Andrew died. I think it's time we looked at them again." I felt something settle in my chest. Not hope, not yet, but control. Control I hadn't had since I was 7 years old, and watched Lydia pour my father's tea with the smile of a woman who knew it was his last cup. As we left the diner, Daniels turned to me just before unlocking his car. "Your father, he once told me you had your mother's spine. I never believed him, not until now." I didn't smile, but I said thank you. Then I turned away. The war had begun, and I wasn't afraid of the dark anymore, because I had lived in it, and now I was the one watching. Lydia's heels made a different sound when she was suspicious. Not the confident, even click of a woman in control, but something shorter, quicker, clipped like a metronome that couldn't quite find its rhythm. I heard it before I saw her, that uneven staccato of panic in patent leather coming down the hallway toward my room. I was sitting cross-legged on the floor when she entered, pretending to polish the brass edge of my footlocker. I didn't look up. "Tasha," she said, her voice tight and too sweet. "What are you doing, darling?" "Just cleaning Aunt Lydia," I replied, glancing over my shoulder with the docile smile she expected. The hinges were catching again. She walked in like a woman pretending to browse, but really hunting. Her eyes scanned the corners, the furniture, the floorboards. Her hands didn't touch anything, but they hovered just enough to tell me she wanted to. Her gaze stopped on the closet door where, behind the shoes and jackets, one of my backup USB drives sat taped under the shelf. "I've been thinking," she said, pacing slowly. "You've been so organized lately. Responsible. Diligent." "Thank you," I said. She didn't smile. "And quiet," she added. A beat passed. I waited. "Have you had any visitors recently?" she asked. Her voice was offhanded, like it didn't matter. That was the first tell. Lydia never asked questions that didn't matter. "No," I said quickly, brushing dust from my jeans. "Should I have?" She tilted her head. "You're not hiding anything from me, are you?" I let my face fall into just the right mixture of confusion and hurt. Not too much, just enough. I don't think so. Did I do something wrong?" Lydia's eyes narrowed for a second too long before she smiled. "No, sweetheart. I'm just checking in. We don't want any misunderstandings in the house." That word misunderstandings landed like a dart. She didn't believe me, and she was about to start digging. That night after lights out, I did what she would never expect. I redirected the target. The next morning over coffee, I casually mentioned to Lydia that the gardener, Mr. Howard, an older man with arthritis and a habit of humming while he trimmed the hedges, had been acting odd. She glanced at me, mild interest disguising the flicker of curiosity. "Odd how—" "I don't know," I said with a shrug. "He was near the garage yesterday and I thought I saw him looking through the old storage bins. Probably nothing." The hook was set. By that afternoon, I caught Lydia standing outside near the shed, sunglasses on arms folded. She wasn't watching the flowers. She was watching him. Later that evening, she summoned the housekeeper, Maria, and I accidentally overheard the conversation from the hallway. "Has Mr. Howard ever been nosy?" Lydia asked, swirling her drink in the crystal glass. Maria hesitated. "He likes to talk. He's harmless." Lydia said, eyes narrowing. "Harmless people rarely are." It wasn't much, but it was enough. Her suspicion had shifted, and with it, her control began to fray. Over the next week, she became restless. She'd start sentences and forget to finish them. She double-checked her calendars, her files. She caught Mason in the hallway one morning and hissed something about keeping an eye on the staff while glancing in my direction. But she didn't search my room again. She was chasing shadows now, exactly where I wanted her. But her panic made her sloppy. I caught it first in her voice one night, yelling into the phone in the conservatory, not knowing I was standing just outside. "Do not call me again unless you have something real," she snapped. "I don't care what the records say. I buried that contract. If it resurfaces, the rest was lost behind the slam of glass doors." I marked the date. I flagged the time. I downloaded the audio from my hidden mic in the plant near the piano. The next day, she called Daniels. I watched from the top of the stairs, crouched just out of view as she spoke to him in the foyer. "You've known Tasha since she was what, a toddler?" she asked, tone falsely light. Daniels didn't blink. "Since the funeral." "She's been a little distant lately," Lydia said. "And so curious. I thought maybe you'd spoken recently. Daniels tilted his head, feigning thought. Can't say I have. She studied him, her smile tight. You always were fond of Andrew? Daniels gave her nothing. She leaned closer. Be careful where you place your loyalties, Howard. Nostalgia can be very expensive. That was when I knew. Lydia was unraveling. She didn't trust me. She didn't trust Daniels. She didn't even trust her own staff. And in a house like this built on control image and tight narratives, paranoia spreads like rot. 3 days later, she installed new locks on her study and added a passcode to her laptop. I found the post-it with the code folded beneath the blotter on her desk. Typical Lydia, meticulous until fear clouded her logic. That same night, she stood outside my room longer than usual. I could see the shadow of her feet beneath the door. Waiting. Listening. Testing. I held my breath until she walked away. In the morning, she was back to smiles and silk scarves, complimenting my hair, and asking if I wanted to join her for brunch downtown. A peace offering from a woman who no longer trusted the people inside her fortress. I declined. I said I wasn't feeling well. But the truth was simpler. I wanted her to have time, alone, to wonder, to spiral. Because the devil doesn't burn in fire. The devil burns in doubt. And Lydia Redfield was starting to catch fire from the inside out. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind where the clouds hang just low enough to remind you that light can be a liar. Lydia was in the drawing room rehearsing her charitable speech for the Redfield Women's League, and I was upstairs watching the security footage on mute from my laptop. Nothing in her posture suggested guilt, not today. She was smooth, even radiant, practicing grief like an actress before a live audience. But across town, a truth long buried was finally clawing its way to the surface. Daniels called that morning. One sentence. No emotion. I found it. I didn't ask what, I already knew. 2 hours later, we sat in the back of his dusty office. The walls were lined with books that hadn't been opened in years, and dust danced like ghosts in the sunlight slicing through the blinds. He slid the manila folder across the table, hands trembling just slightly. I didn't touch it right away. You're sure I asked? He nodded. This was filed 3 weeks before your father died. The ink's dry, the signatures verified, notarized, dated, witnessed. I opened it, and there it was. My father's handwriting, bold, deliberate, with that slight curve in his Y's. He always signed documents like he was staking a claim. The language was direct. In the event of my death, my estate shall pass primarily to my daughter, Tasha Dawson. Lydia Redfield and Mason Redfield shall act only as temporary custodians until she reaches the age of majority. Under no circumstance shall either party assume permanent control of the Redfield estate financial assets or trust accounts. The word only had been underlined 3 times. My throat closed. A pressure rose in my chest, not rage, not sorrow, something worse. Recognition. This wasn't a case of forgotten paperwork. Lydia had found this document and buried it, burned it from the record, replaced it with a lie that wore just enough truth to pass legal muster. And the world had bought it. Even I had. For 10 years. She knew, I whispered. Daniels nodded. She filed a revised version 4 days after his death. Completely different language. Your name wasn't even listed. My pulse roared in my ears. That can't be legal. It wasn't, he said. But Lydia timed it well. She had a judge in her pocket, someone who owed her family favors from the estate consolidation in '93. The court never saw the original. I only found this because your father insisted I keep a sealed copy of everything in a separate fire-safe vault completely offline. He trusted me. I swallowed. And yet you never told me. His eyes dropped. I had no proof she'd tampered with anything, and she made sure I was shut out of everything within days of Andrew's passing. I pushed back once she threatened to accuse me of coercion, claimed I manipulated Andrew in his last days. It would have turned into a scandal. I had no standing. Silence stretched between us. Then he said quietly, until now. I stared at the will again. It felt radioactive in my hands. Legal proof that the last decade of my life had been stolen, forged, falsified behind the veil of grief. I was meant to have it all, I said. Not the money, not the house, the choice, the power, my life. I was never supposed to be trapped in that basement. No, he agreed. You weren't? The grief hit late after the anger. It always does. It's quieter. Heavier doesn't make you scream, but makes you sit very still and wonder how different your life could have been if someone had just told the truth. But I didn't cry. I couldn't afford to. Not yet. We need a forensic team, I said, to compare both documents. I want expert testimony. I already contacted one, Daniels replied, and I'll petition for an exhumation of the probate case. With the journal entries from your mother and the metadata from the video files you've collected, Tasha, we're not dealing with theory anymore. No, I said. We're dealing with theft, perjury, fraud, and accessory to murder. I stood up the will, folded neatly into a folder I would never let leave my sight again. She'll try to spin this, I said. Pretend she did it to protect me. That my father was unstable, that he changed his mind. Then we bury her into paper, Daniel said. In facts, in timestamps, in every lie she ever notarized. I nodded once, and I left. Back at Redfield Manor, Lydia was on the phone laughing. Something about donors and silent auctions. I walked past her without a glance, the folder now tucked inside the hollowed-out interior of a law textbook in my bag. She didn't look up. She didn't suspect a thing. Not yet. But her days of power were numbered, because I wasn't just a girl with a grudge. I was the rightful heir. And I had the will to prove it. There's a difference between revenge and strategy. Revenge is emotional, raw, reactive. Strategy is cold, precise. It studies the terrain before striking. And I was done bleeding. I was done surviving. It was time to dismantle the Redfield lie with the same silence it had used to bury me. It began with a wall. I cleared a corner of my room, the only private space I had left, and turned it into a war room. A corkboard, push pins, thread lines, timestamps. I printed out every key frame from the camera footage, Lydia pocketing financial documents from my father's desk. Mason arguing on the phone, holding a vial of something in the pantry. A moment where Lydia's hand passed a teacup across the table, her eyes smiling, her mouth tight. It wasn't conclusive evidence on its own, but together with my mother's diary and the will Daniels had unearthed, it told a story. A story too ugly for polite society. But society doesn't change from whispers. It changes with exposure. So I started building the narrative. The footage wasn't enough. The documents weren't enough. The will alone, though damning, wouldn't capture public sympathy. I needed something visceral, something that hit like a punch to the gut. So I gave my mother her voice back. I recorded a voiceover, quiet, steady, using her own words from the journals. Her final entries. Her fears. Her slow, terrifying realization that the people in her house were not family, but predators in pearls. Her handwriting became monologue. Her final day became a timeline. And while her voice echoed in my headphones, I layered it over footage. The house. The teacups. The slow deterioration of her handwriting. Side-by-side comparisons of Lydia's public donations and the bank statements showing withdrawal from my father's accounts. The final shot, a frame of my mother's signature on the will dissolving into ash beside the forged version Lydia submitted to probate. It wasn't a documentary. It was an indictment, and I planned to release it when every eye was on her. But for that, I needed an audience. I needed reach. I needed Natalie Quinn. I found Natalie's work through a deep web of local news archives and buried scandals. She wasn't just a reporter. She was the kind of journalist who made enemies in country clubs. Fired once for refusing to kill a story about a real estate mogul who abused his sister's power of attorney. Now she worked freelance. Independent. Dangerous in the best way. She answered my email within an hour. A burner email. Anonymous address. I never said who I was, just that I had evidence of a murder covered up by power and money in one of the wealthiest estates in the county. Her reply was one line. Meet. I'll bring gloves. We met in the back of a closed florist shop, her safe house. No cameras, no microphones. She showed me her credentials and I showed her the video. No names, just images, dates, footage, my mother's voice. Natalie didn't blink, didn't speak for a full 5 minutes. Then she said, Jesus Christ. I want it released, I said on the night of the Redfield Estate's 10-year commemorative gala. She raised her brows. You mean the thinnest excuse for a thieving widow to parade in silk while her husband's corpse spins in his grave? I almost smiled. Exactly. She leaned forward. Why not now? Because she's prepared for now, not for then. Natalie stared at me like she'd seen this kind of fire before. Maybe in courtrooms, maybe in other survivors, maybe in her own bathroom mirror. You know they'll come after you once this breaks, she said. I'm counting on it. She nodded slowly. Fine. I'll prep it for a midnight drop. Audio cleaned, metadata intact. You want a voiceover or you want her words to speak alone? Her words. But I'll do the intro. And you want your name on it? I paused. And then I said yes. She took my name when she forged that will. I want it back in fire. Natalie smiled like a soldier being handed a rifle. Let's burn a dynasty. Back at Redfield, the house was buzzing with preparations. Lydia was obsessed with the gala, what she called the final proof of legacy. It was all champagne orders and custom lighting. A professional harpist had already been hired. Florists were scheduled. Local press had RSVP'd. It was going to be a spectacle of control status and image. Exactly what I needed. Every mask looks beautiful seconds before it cracks. I spent the next week finalizing the video coding a time-released upload through a shadow site Natalie used for sensitive drops. I gave Daniels a sealed envelope with the original will and the legal declaration of forgery ready to file once the story went public. He'd already contacted a probate judge from out of county, a clean one. The dominoes were lined up. All I had to do was flick the first. The night of the gala was set for October 28th, 10 years to the day since my father's death. Lydia called it an anniversary of remembrance. I called it the beginning of her end. And as I zipped up the black satin dress she'd laid out for me, fitted simple, deceptively elegant, I looked in the mirror and didn't see the basement girl anymore. I saw the architect of her ruin. The world was about to meet the real Redfield legacy. And it wasn't built on charity. It was built on blood. The chandeliers in the Redfield ballroom hadn't gleamed this brightly since my parents were alive. Every prism of glass above flickered like 1,000 tiny lies, catching the light of rented elegance and soft jazz. Lydia moved through it all like a queen dressed in deep crimson silk that clung to her dignity like armor. Her hair was perfect, her smile sharper than the knives on the buffet table. She was untouchable, or so she thought. Outside, camera crews from 2 local news stations buzzed at the gate. Inside, the scent of white roses and wealth clung to the air like perfume laced with poison. Tonight, Lydia cooed into the microphone, tapping her flute of champagne. We honor legacy. We honor love. And we turn the page on 10 beautiful years of growth, stewardship, and commitment to the Redfield name. Applause broke out like programmed thunder. I stood near the back, near the edge of the ballroom, wearing the same black satin dress she'd chosen for me like I was a trophy on display, silent and shining. Only I wasn't silent tonight. Lydia raised her glass again, eyes glistening. And in that spirit, I'm proud to announce that as of midnight tonight, ownership of the Redfield estate and foundation will formally pass to my husband's estate and through legal trust into my continued care. It was subtle, but I caught the shift in Daniel's jaw from across the room. He knew that was a lie. She was positioning herself to absorb everything completely. She wasn't just corrupt, she was trying to erase my father from history. I stepped forward, heels echoing on the marble. My hands weren't trembling. My voice was calm. "Excuse me," I said. She turned toward me, smiling at first, puzzled, curious, until I reached for the small remote in my pocket. The ballroom went dark. Gasps rippled across the guests like wind through dry grass. And then click. A screen dropped down behind the stage. Lydia turned, confused, disoriented. She wasn't used to surprises in her house. The video began. It opened with a family photo. My father, my mother and me, age 5, laughing in the garden. Then a slow zoom on my mother's journal pages, her handwriting appearing as if written in real time across the screen. "Something's wrong. I tasted it again in the tea today." Andrew said his heart raced all night. "I think it's her." Then audio. Her voice, my voice, reading her words layered over the footage. Gentle, raw. "If you're hearing this, I'm likely gone. And if Lydia's still smiling at you, be careful. Her kindness is just a quieter kind of killing." The footage changed. Lydia handing a teacup to my mother. Mason pouring something into a bottle under the kitchen table. Snapshots, time-stamped, dates, metadata in the corner. The camera in the grandfather clock had caught more than she ever realized. The gasps turned to murmurs. Someone dropped their glass. Lydia stood frozen, her champagne still raised like a useless scepter. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Daniels stepped forward now, holding the official will, my father's real will, and placed it on the podium like it was scripture. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "the rightful heir to this estate is Miss Tasha Dawson. The woman currently posing as guardian has committed fraud, will forgery, and pending further investigation may be complicit in premeditated murder." Lydia's voice finally returned. "This is insane!" she screamed. "She's a child, a disturbed child. This is a vendetta." But the screen didn't stop. The next clip showed Lydia calling the family attorney hours after my father's death, instructing him to discard an older draft of the will. And then came the final image, my mother's signature fading, dissolving into ash next to the forged version. A line appeared beneath. "Justice buried will rise." The ballroom fell silent. Lydia dropped her glass. It shattered at her feet. "No," she muttered. You can't do this to me." "I didn't," I said quietly, stepping onto the stage beside her. "You did it to yourself." Her eyes were wild now, darting, searching for someone to back her up. Mason wasn't here, he'd left town 2 days before. Daniels wasn't moving. The guests were backing away like they'd seen the true face beneath her mask. And that's when the lights came on again, full brightness. And so did the flash of police badges. Two officers stepped forward, calm, firm. Lydia Redfield. One said you are under investigation for will tampering, obstruction of justice, and suspected involvement in the death of Andrew Dawson. No, wait, she pleaded, stumbling back. This isn't happening. She's nothing. She lived in the basement. Yes, I said steady, and I rose from it. The moment her hands were cuffed, Lydia stopped screaming. The silence that followed was sacred. She was escorted out the front door she once guarded like a throne, and I stood on the stage not triumphant, but free. The room didn't erupt in applause. It didn't need to. They had seen the truth, and for once the truth was louder than the legacy. The Redfield mask had shattered, and all that was left beneath it was blood. The silence didn't last. When the doors shut behind Lydia Redfield and the clicking of her heels on marble gave way to the hard clack of police boots, something cracked beneath the gilded surface of Redfield Manor. It wasn't just reputation. It was structure centuries of power fraying in seconds. I stepped down from the stage. My hands were still trembling, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. Guests murmured in confusion, some filming with shaky phones, others just standing still, their drinks untouched, like they were waking up from a cult they didn't know they'd joined. That's when a scream pierced through the chaos. Not from the ballroom, from upstairs. The library. A maid burst in, pale and gasping, pointing toward the grand staircase. I didn't hesitate. Neither did Daniels. We ran. Up the red-carpeted stairs past the portraits of the dead down the corridor, where dust never settled as if the house itself was holding its breath. The library door was shut, locked. From the inside, we pounded. Mason opened the door. Nothing. Daniel stepped back and lunged with his shoulder. Once. Twice. On the third strike, the antique lock gave way and the door flew open. And the scent hit us first. Gunpowder and silence. Mason Redfield. My uncle was slumped in the leather chair behind my father's desk. The revolver still dangled from his hand. His mouth was slack. His eyes, wide and vacant, stared at the ceiling where he used to hang maps of foreign lands he never visited. On the desk, a folded piece of parchment. I didn't need to read it, but I did. She told me it was painless, that they wouldn't feel it, that it was only tea. I watched them die in pieces, and I drank wine beside their caskets. I see them now in every mirror. I see her. I can't look anymore. Daniels turned away. I didn't. I stood still, took it in, not out of vengeance, out of confirmation. It was real. They had done it. Together. And now he'd chosen silence one final time. Downstairs, the police had begun to escort Lydia to a waiting car, her wrists bound, her head still held high until she saw me at the top of the stairs. Her face twisted. "You think this is justice?" she howled, her voice guttural now, cracking under the pressure of unraveling control. "She's lying. This was all a performance, a child's revenge." The press had arrived. Flash bulbs ignited the night like white lightning. Cameras rolled. Reporters leaned over the gates shouting, "Lydia, is it true you forged the will? What do you say to the claim you poisoned your own sister? Is it true your niece was living in the basement?" She thrashed in the officer's grip, eyes bloodshot. "It's her word against mine. She was always broken. And then she made the fatal mistake." She looked at the cameras and screamed, "No one cares about a girl from the basement." That was the soundbite. That was the moment. By morning it was everywhere. The basement girl who brought down the Redfields. Orphaned heiress exposes family's deadly deceit. Tasha Dawson, from forgotten to fearless. My face was pixelated in some images, not in others, but the footage, the confession, the will. It spread like wildfire. Local anchors, national networks, true crime bloggers, podcasts, opinion columns. Everyone wanted a piece of the story, and everyone had one name on their lips, Tasha. I didn't leave the manor that night. I didn't sleep either. I sat in the garden where that old photo of my parents had been taken. The roses were overgrown now, the trellis leaning slightly. The world was watching, but I was finally still. Daniels came out just before dawn. He looked exhausted, but something in his face, softness, maybe pride, cut through the fatigue. "They've frozen the Redfield accounts," he said. "Investigators are on site. The DA wants a formal interview. You'll have to decide how public you want to be." I nodded. "She said no one would care," I murmured. He sat beside me, and she was wrong. We sat there for a while, listening. The kind of quiet you don't get unless a house has finally stopped lying. Mason's body was gone now. The library door sealed. Lydia was in custody. The staff had left. Or maybe they were hiding. And me. I was still Tasha from the basement. Only now, the house knew it too. The mansion was too quiet. Not the quiet of peace, but the echoing kind that follows war. When the last scream has died out, the last bullet has fallen, and all that remains is breath and broken chandeliers. Tasha sat on the edge of her old cot in the basement. It hadn't changed. The same mildew-stained bricks, the same single bulb swinging from a frayed wire, the same dusty mirror propped against the wall, warped enough that her reflection looked like someone else entirely. She hadn't slept. Not since the gala. Not since Lydia's screams. Not since the gunshot upstairs. Her victory had come and gone like a thunderclap, and now all she could feel was nothing. She had exposed them, destroyed them, freed herself from the chains they pretended were care. The world outside was talking about her like she was a storm, the girl from the basement, the heir who rose from ashes, the silent justice. But here in this room, the silence wasn't triumphant. It was hollow, a ghost. She ran her fingers along the side of the cot, the rusted metal cold beneath her fingertips. How many nights had she laid here staring at the ceiling, imagining that the truth, just the truth, would be enough to save her? And now that she had it, the truth felt heavier than the lie. Her eyes landed on the old chest again, the one where she had found the journals. It was half open, the last page of her mother's handwriting sticking out from beneath the cracked leather cover. She reached for it. The page was familiar. She had read it before, but tonight in this silence the words felt different, like a final whisper waiting to bloom. Don't live for revenge, Tasha. Live for rising. Let the weight they gave you become your wings. If you find this, I'm already gone, but you are not. Not broken, not buried, and never too far to climb. Her breath caught in her throat. She read it again, and again, until the silence cracked not with a sound, but with the slow, flooding warmth of grief. She cried, not because she was broken or because she had lost something. She cried because for the first time there was space to feel. Not to fight, not to hide, just to feel. It was the cry of a child who had been denied softness, of a girl who had survived in shadows so long she forgot light didn't have to burn. When it passed, she wasn't empty. She was clean. She folded the letter and slipped it into the inside pocket of her coat. Then she walked to the door and turned off the light. She didn't need to sleep in the basement anymore. Upstairs, the house creaked like it was exhaling for the first time in a decade. The walls weren't whispering anymore. They were listening. Tasha walked the halls not as a prisoner, not even as an heir, but as someone who didn't need to prove anything anymore. She stepped into the study, her father's old sanctuary. It still smelled like oak and old ink. The curtains were drawn and morning light spilled in through the cracks like forgiveness. On the desk was a stack of newspaper clippings. Daniels had left them. Redfield widow arrested in shocking estate scandal. From basement to throne, the unfolding story of Tasha Dawson. Silent no more. She turned them over one by one, not out of pride, but clarity. The world saw her now, but what mattered was how she saw herself. She didn't belong to this house. It had forged her, yes, but she wasn't its shadow anymore. She looked around the portraits, the heirlooms, the silver-framed masks of legacy, and felt nothing but distance. These weren't her roots. They were her chains. She opened the window, let the air sweep in. Then she called Daniels. "I want to sell the manor," she said. He was quiet on the other end for a moment. "Are you sure?" "Yes. Sell it. Tear it down. Turn it into something useful. I don't care. Not even a part of it. I lived in the basement," she said. "There is no part of it I want to keep." Daniels understood. "Then I'll begin the process. But you should know there will be pushback. Historical societies, inheritance lawyers." "Let them." He hesitated. "And you? Where will you go?" Tasha looked out the window. "I don't know, but I'll go as myself." The Redfield name had tried to consume her, tried to shape her silence into weakness. But now her silence was a choice, a fortress, a seed. Because sometimes the loudest legacy is the one that refuses to repeat history. The letterhead was simple. No gold leaf, no family crest. Just her name. Tasha Dawson. Underneath it in soft gray font, whispering Roots Foundation. Daniels looked over the final draft of the press release with his reading glasses low on his nose. "It's understated," he murmured. "That's the point," Tasha replied. They sat in a quiet office downtown, rented not inherited. A space filled with morning light and secondhand furniture. The air smelled like paper and promise. Outside the window, the city pulsed with movement lives, intersecting hurting healing just like hers. But not everyone gets the chance to rise from the basement. That's why she was here. Tasha took a breath and reread the opening line out loud. "The Redfield estate will be sold at public auction. All proceeds will go directly to the Whispering Roots Foundation, dedicated to supporting children who have suffered abuse, neglect, or emotional trauma within their own homes." She looked up. "It's not about erasing the past," she said. "It's about planting something better in its place." Daniels gave her a long, quiet look. He'd known her father, had seen the Redfield family at their most powerful, their most polished. But now, sitting across from the girl they tried to bury, he knew he was witnessing something rarer than vengeance. Redemption. Not for the Redfields. For the broken children they never saw. The press conference was small by design. A single microphone. No stage. Just Tasha in a navy blue coat, her mother's locket around her neck, standing outside the manor gates. Behind her, Redfield Manor loomed. Still intact, but stripped of illusion. Cameras flashed, but she didn't flinch. I lived in that house for 16 years, she began, voice steady. Not as a daughter, not as family, but as someone hidden, told I was a burden, a debt, a stain on their legacy. She paused, then looked straight into the lens. I believed it, for a long time. A hush fell. But I was never the stain. Silence was never my weakness. It was my seed. And now I'm choosing to turn that silence into something living. Something that whispers back to every child who's ever been locked in a basement or a bedroom or behind the smile of someone they're told to trust. She stepped aside. Behind her, a new sign was unveiled. Future site of the Whispering Roots Center for Youth Recovery. One reporter raised their hand. Why not keep the estate? Turn it into a museum. Tasha didn't hesitate. You don't build healing on top of rot. You clear the ground. You dig deep. You plant something stronger. Within weeks, the auction took place. The manor's antiques were appraised, cataloged, and sold: paintings, sculptures, even Lydia's infamous pearl collection. Bidders came from across the country. Some came for spectacle, others for history. But every gavel strike was a nail in the coffin of the Redfield legacy. The building itself, purchased by a nonprofit partner, set to be demolished by spring. Tasha didn't attend the auction. Instead, she stood in a children's shelter 2 towns over, reading to a group of wide-eyed boys and girls who had come from broken places. She didn't tell them her story, not yet. She didn't want them to see her as different. She wanted them to see her as proof. Proof that pain isn't the end. Proof that silence can bloom. The Whispering Roots Foundation launched quietly, but swiftly. Daniel served as the legal advisor. A board of counselors, survivors, social workers, and child psychologists came together. The mission was clear. No more forgotten children. No more locked doors. No more secrets allowed to rot in basements. Tasha didn't seek attention. She turned down interviews, refused book deals, declined podcast invites. I'm not a brand, she told Daniels. I'm a beginning. But word spread anyway, not just because of the scandal, but because of the sincerity. Whispering Roots wasn't just an organization, it was a haven. A place for children to speak, scream, sing, and heal without fear of not being believed. One morning, as winter loosened its grip and green began returning to the fields, Tasha stood on the rubble of what had once been the Redfield Library. All that remained was dust memory and the iron skeleton of something too proud to bend. In her hands, she held a sapling, an oak. She knelt down, pressed it into the soil, and whispered to it just once. Not a wish, not a prayer, a promise. No child will ever sleep underground again. And the roots began to take. It began with a knock, barely a sound, against the new glass of the office door. Tasha looked up from her desk. The man standing outside wore a faded cap and a navy coat stained with old paint and time. He looked familiar. She opened the door slowly. Miss Dawson? He asked, his voice roughened by age, dust, and something unspoken. Yes, she said cautiously. I was the groundskeeper at Redfield. Name's Jonas. Jonas Heller. Worked for your family since before you were born, until they let me go. Until... His eyes didn't meet hers at first, but when they did, she saw something deeper than nostalgia. Guilt. I shouldn't bother you, he murmured, almost stepping away. Just wanted to say, I saw what you did. And your parents, they'd be proud. Especially your dad. She blinked. You knew him well. I did, Jonas said, stepping back inside the room, removing his cap with both hands as if entering sacred ground. I tended that rose garden outside his office for 23 years. He used to talk to me more than he did to the board. Tasha gestured gently for him to sit, and that's when it began, slowly, like rain sliding down glass. Jonas spoke of late-night walks, of quiet arguments, of voices raised behind closed doors. Her father, Grant Dawson, had tried desperately to pull away from a real estate deal that Lydia and her husband were orchestrating, a massive redevelopment on disputed land. It would have meant displacing low-income families, environmental violations, bribing city officials. He said it wasn't the legacy he wanted to leave. Jonas said, his knuckles white. He tried to back out, said it smelled like rot. Lydia told him he'd destroy everything they'd built. And then Tasha asked, her voice barely a whisper. He got sick. Fast. I wasn't the only one who noticed, but I was the only one she couldn't control, I think. She told me to stay out of family business, And one day I came to work and the garden gate was chained shut. He placed something on her desk. A photo. Her father and Jonas standing beside the rose trellis, both younger, sun-drenched, and smiling. Tasha stared at it, her throat closed. He wasn't weak, Jonas said. He chose to walk away. He just didn't know how much it would cost. That evening, Tasha returned to Redfield Manor for the first time since the demolition started. Most of it was already gone, only a skeleton remained, torn wood and bricks scattered like memory shards. But the kitchen, still standing. She stepped over a beam and into what used to be the heart of the house, the place where her mother had made cinnamon tea on rainy mornings. The place where she would hum softly, never full lyrics, just the melody, as if afraid words would shatter. Tasha opened a cabinet. Dust, a chipped cup, nothing else. She sat down on the cold floor. Her hands trembled as she reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out the photograph. Then slowly, she pulled out something else, a crumpled old Polaroid. Her mother flower on her cheek holding a wooden spoon like a microphone. Her father behind her, mid-laugh, arms around her waist. It was taken in this very room. Tasha hadn't remembered the photo until now. It had been hidden at the bottom of her mother's journal. She hadn't understood why she kept it. But now in this place it made perfect sense. It wasn't just a kitchen. It was resistance. Joy preserved. Legacy unpoisoned. Tasha pressed her palm against the wall, closed her eyes, and let it come. The grief. The gratitude. The ache of knowing they had tried. They had tried to protect her, tried to escape the machinery Lydia had constructed. They just hadn't been able to outrun it. But she had. She was still here, and that meant their love had survived. Not unbroken but unburied. She stayed there until the sun dipped low and the wind stirred the ash outside. As she stood, her foot bumped something under the counter. A wooden spice box. Dusty. Forgotten. She picked it up. Inside were tiny jars, most empty, some still holding the faintest scent of cardamom, rosemary, cloves. Her mother's spices. And wedged between them a folded scrap of paper. One word in soft handwriting. Bloom. Tasha held it to her chest and smiled. Even in the ruins, something always tried to grow. The final beam of Redfield Manor fell at 6:12 a.m. The wrecking crew paused afterward, letting the dust settle like old ghosts, finally given permission to sleep. All that remained now was rubble silence and the faint outline of what once tried to pass for a home. Tasha stood across the field, arms wrapped around a small wooden urn. She didn't speak. Didn't need to. The past had already spoken loud enough. At her feet, the grass near the southern slope of the estate still grew wild, untamed, and softer than anywhere else on the property. Her mother used to sit here with her in rare moments of peace, braiding her hair, singing melodies she never finished. She called this spot the Quiet Hill. Now it would become a resting place. Tasha knelt, the urn pressed gently to her chest. The wind whispered through the brush as if waiting. She opened the lid. A wisp of ash caught the early sunlight, sparkling for a moment before falling. She tilted the urn slowly, letting the remains of her mother scatter along the stream bank, just as her journal had asked. Tasha stood still, eyes shut, until the last of the ashes were gone. Then she whispered, "You're free now, Mom," finally. Later that afternoon, the Whispering Root Center echoed with laughter and voices small high, full of new beginnings. Tasha walked through the halls quietly, not as an administrator or a founder, but as someone still learning how to take up space. Every corner of the center was designed with purpose. Soft walls, open spaces, quiet zones, warm lighting. No one here was watched. No one here was locked in. She paused outside the art room. Inside, children painted on canvas paper walls. No rules, just color. And that's where she met Zoe. The little girl couldn't have been more than 9. She had frizzy curls tied up in uneven pigtails and paint-stained fingers. Her canvas was a blur of bold strokes, black, red, gold, all fighting for space. She saw Tasha and tilted her head. "Are you the lady from the news?" Tasha smiled softly. "Some people say that." Zoe squinted. "You used to live in a castle or something?" Tasha laughed. "Something like that." Zoe pointed to her painting. "This is my scary house, but I'm gonna paint flowers on top." "That sounds beautiful," Tasha said, crouching beside her. The little girl hesitated, then looked up. "Were you scared?" she asked. Tasha paused. 1,000 memories swirled. The cold basement floor, the sound of Lydia's footsteps, the journal entries, the silence. And still she was scared. Every day. But fear wasn't her enemy anymore. She leaned in close. "I still get scared, Zoe. I just don't let fear tell me what to do anymore." Zoe's eyes widened like the idea was both brand new and quietly familiar. "Even when you told on bad people, especially then." Zoe nodded slowly like a seed had been planted. Then she whispered, "Can I paint a horse next to the flowers?" "You can paint a whole stampede," Tasha said. They both smiled. In the garden behind the center built on the same land where the manor once stood, Tasha walked among the rows of saplings planted by the children. They called them survivor trees. Each tree had a ribbon, each ribbon a name. Some names were real. Some names were just feelings. One was tied with a simple word, mine. Tasha knelt beside it. Her ribbon was there too. Not her legal name. Just one word, voice. She reached out and touched it. And for the first time in her life, the ground beneath her didn't feel like it was swallowing her whole. It felt like it was holding her. It began with the sound of expensive shoes crunching gravel. Tasha was sitting on the back steps of the Whispering Root Center, sipping lukewarm tea and letting the early autumn wind brush her face when she heard them heels. Dress shoes, voices that hadn't spoken her name in years, unless it was with pity, superiority, or both. She turned slowly. 3 of them stood at the gate: Aunt Beverly, who once told her she looked like the forgotten one; Cousin Raymond, who had spent years posting photos with Lydia like he was her golden child; and Terrence, the cousin who used to call her basement girl. They wore black not for mourning but for theatrics. "Can we talk?" Beverly asked, her voice thin, her eyes scanning the building behind Tasha as if it were an alien thing. Tasha didn't answer. She stood and opened the gate. They followed her in silence to a side room just off the library. She didn't offer tea. She didn't sit. Beverly went first. "We heard about the sale of the estate," Raymond added. "We were hoping you might consider distributing some of the assets. You know, keeping it in the family." Tasha raised an eyebrow. "Family?" Terrence flinched. "We know things were complicated with Lydia, but we all lost something too." "Did you?" Tasha asked, her voice steady. No one responded. She turned toward the tall glass windows behind her. "You know," she said, "for years I dreamed of this moment, of being in a position where I could decide who gets what. I thought I'd feel powerful, vindicated." She turned back. "But I don't feel powerful. I feel clean, free, and I have no intention of dirtying myself again." Raymond looked like he wanted to argue, but she cut him off. "I lived in a basement while you drank champagne upstairs. I scrubbed your shoes while you laughed about the little ghost in the walls. You called me invisible. You made me believe I was." They looked down. Tasha folded her arms. "The assets are gone. The manor is gone. Everything you're clinging to is ash." "But the money," Beverly tried. Tasha stepped forward. "The money built this. A place for the kids you never see, for the stories you never heard, for the voices you chose to silence." She opened the door. "This time I'm choosing silence. Goodbye." Later that week, the press returned. They came not to chase a scandal, but to follow up one last interview, they said. A legacy piece. Tasha agreed to meet at the garden. The journalist was young, maybe early 30s, eyes sharp but kind. She wore a lavender scarf and carried a voice recorder but never once looked at her phone during the conversation. They sat on a stone bench beneath one of the oldest trees still left from the Redfield estate. "I want to talk about what's next," the reporter said. "You've become something of a national symbol, survivor of generational abuse, whistleblower, founder of one of the most impactful child advocacy centers in the country. Some are calling you the Silent Justice." Tasha chuckled softly. "That's a dramatic title, but fitting, isn't it?" She looked out across the grass where children were chasing bubbles. "No, I never wanted to be a symbol. I just wanted the truth to be seen, that's all." The reporter tilted her head. "Was it worth it? The fight?" Tasha hesitated. "Some nights I still wake up reaching for light that isn't there. Some wounds don't close. But yes, it was worth it. Because I know no child under this roof will ever feel like I once did." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was old, nearly falling apart, but she kept it like a compass. It was the last page of her mother's journal. She handed it to the reporter. "Read it aloud." The reporter adjusted her voice recorder and read, "To my Tasha. If you ever read this, it means I failed to protect you. But I know you. I know your spine is stronger than their lies. You may live in darkness for a while, but one day you'll light the whole sky. And even if you walk alone, I'll walk with you in the quiet places. Speak your truth, even if your voice trembles. Love always, Mom." When the reporter finished, her voice cracked. Tasha smiled. "That's the only legacy I care about." The interview ended not with a camera flash, but with silence. A different kind of silence. One that honored, not erased. Outside, Zoe waved at Tasha from across the yard, her painted fingers held high. Tasha waved back. She didn't need approval. She had clarity. And in the wind she heard it again, not the voices of the past, but her own echoing forward. The room was quiet, save for the soft ticking of an old clock and the faint echo of children laughing somewhere beyond the hallway. It was a small space, barely the size of a pantry, but here, tucked in the heart of the Whispering Roots Center, Tasha had created something sacred. A chessboard sat in the middle of the table, its pieces carefully arranged. The queen, white, smooth, slightly worn, stood proudly in the center, dominating the board. Tasha sat before it, her elbows on the table, her fingers laced beneath her chin. She stared at the queen in silence. Outside the window, dusk was settling in. The last sliver of golden light stretched across the floor, illuminating half the board like a spotlight on memory. Her breath was steady now, measured. Then softly, like a ripple in still water, came the flashback. Tasha, her father's voice, warm and gentle, echoed from a time that no longer existed. He sat across from her in the Redfield library back when books still whispered secrets and not accusations. The chessboard between them was the same one she now used, reclaimed, restored. She was just a girl, legs too short for the chair, brow furrowed in frustration. "I don't get it," she muttered. "Why is the queen the most powerful?" Her father chuckled. "Because she moves the way no one expects. Forward, backward, sideways. She sees everything, but hides her strength until the right moment." He leaned in, tapping the white queen. "She's the one they forget to fear, until checkmate." Back in the present, Tasha reached forward and gently picked up the queen. It was heavier than she remembered. Not in weight, but in meaning. They used to call her the daughter of the help. They said she was lucky to be housed, lucky to be fed, lucky to be tolerated. They never saw her strength, never noticed the way her mind worked, silent, calculating, resilient. They thought her silence was surrender, but it had always been strategy. Checkmate wasn't loud. It was deliberate, measured, final. There was a knock on the door. A young girl, Maya, peeked in, one of the center's newest arrivals. She had the same wary eyes Tasha once wore like armor. "Miss Dawson?" she asked, almost in a whisper. "Yes, sweetheart." Maya stepped into the room, glancing shyly at the board. "Can you teach me how to play?" Tasha smiled. "Of course, but you have to promise me something first." Maya tilted her head. "What?" "That you'll never let anyone decide your moves for you." Maya nodded slowly. Tasha motioned for her to sit. "Good. Now let me tell you a secret about the queen." As she began to explain, her voice steady and low, another memory surfaced, not a vision, but a whisper from her mother's journal. That final entry etched into her soul. "They may call you invisible, but I call you hope. And one day hope will win." Tasha looked at Maya, who was now mimicking her movements on the board. This was why she stayed. Why she built the center. Why she didn't run even when the past screamed at her to disappear. Redfield was gone. But the girl it tried to bury had become the woman building futures. And they would never bury her again. Outside, the garden was blooming again. Saplings that once looked too fragile to survive the frost had taken root. Their branches stretched upward, shameless and defiant, toward a sky no longer clouded by secrets. In the courtyard stood a small plaque, simple and brushed in bronze, in memory of all who were silenced, and in honor of those who spoke anyway. Below it, a single word was engraved: hope. A local journalist passing through the center noticed Tasha by the chess table and asked almost sheepishly if he could ask one final question. She didn't stop arranging the board as she spoke. "People call you a symbol now," he said, "of justice, survival, silent revenge. Do you see yourself that way?" Tasha's fingers paused on the queen. Then, with a soft smile, she shook her head. "I'm not a symbol," she said. "I'm a daughter." He looked confused. "A daughter of a woman they tried to erase," she added. "They called me a mistake, a burden, the child of a housemaid. But my mother—" She turned toward this window where light pooled like blessing. "My mother called me Hope." She gently placed the queen back on the board. And hope doesn't need permission to win. That night, as the center fell into calm hush and the stars opened like soft wounds across the sky, Tasha returned to her quiet room. She sat once more in front of the chessboard, only now the queen was gone. In its place stood a small photograph, faded old, still intact. It showed a woman in a white apron, her hair wrapped in a scarf, holding a baby against her chest. Her smile was tired, but her eyes were fire. Tasha traced her mother's face with a fingertip. "I made it, Mama," she whispered. "And I made sure they remember your name." Then she stood, turned off the light, and walked into the future, no longer a shadow, but the woman who survived the storm and rewrote the story. Checkmate.